I experienced something a couple of weeks ago that I was going to share on the channel, but that I chose not to because, frankly, I decided it wasn't true. It was the furthest from fact that we could get, and the last thing the internet needs, especially in the world of social media, is more misinformation, more fake news, more falsehoods. But over the last couple of weeks, I have come to think differently. This is a story about Jesus Christ, and it's a story that I originally didn't even want to talk about because I viewed it as made for B-budget horror movie type. It deals with stigmata. Could you imagine? You hear about people accepting Jesus Christ as their Savior. You hear about all the different come to Jesus moments. If you've been to church and you hear them preaching, they are always talking about, accept Jesus as your Savior. Well, what happens when Jesus actually comes to you and you don't choose Jesus, you don't choose God, but God the Father and His Son Jesus choose you? That's what this story is about. I didn't believe it, as I've already said. You'll have to hear this story, take it for what it's worth, and make your own decision. But I'm convinced it's true. So let's talk about, for instance, you'll hear people say, oh, I was a sinner, I was this, I was that, I was a drunk, I was an alcoholic, I was a drug addict, or I abused my wife, or I cheated on my wife, I was mean to my kids. Jesus came into my life and I was a completely different person. Is this possible? Is this real? Does this really happen out here in the real world with common people? Well, I thought there's nowhere better to look to see if this is true than to look at the life of someone, say like George Foreman, 2-time heavyweight champion of the world. And you're like, oh gosh, Crazy Lake, you hooked me with the title. You got me in the first couple of minutes of this video. I'm sitting on the edge of my seat to hear what happened. And now you're going to talk about George Foreman? Yeah, I am going to talk about George Foreman. I'm going to talk about basically 3 different George Foremans. Hear me out and let me know if you think this makes sense. So you think of George Foreman. I'm 48. People my age, in my age group, think of George Foreman and they think of everybody's favorite grandfather, big, lovable, huggable teddy bear. I can remember when he upset the world of boxing and sports in general and became the heavyweight champion of the world for the second time when he defeated undefeated Michael Moore, 26-year-old man in his prime, who'd recently beaten Evander Holyfield to win the title. Holyfield, of course, beat Foreman before that a couple years when Foreman was making his comeback in his mid-40s, late 40s. George Foreman was 46 when he beat Moore. He became the oldest heavyweight boxing champion in history, still holds that title. But people who knew George Foreman won, the first George Foreman, the George Foreman that lost to Muhammad Ali in the Rumble in the Jungle back in 1974, October of 74. I turned 1 in November of 74, so I wasn't even a year old yet. George Foreman was, what was he, 36-0, 33 wins by knockout. Most of his fights didn't last for 3 rounds. He beat the dickens out of Muhammad Ali round after round after round. And I've watched him in numerous interviews afterwards, and George Foreman said he hit Muhammad Ali with everything he had. And around round 6 or round 7, Muhammad Ali leans over and whispers or yells in his ear, "Is that all you got, George?" And that's when George knew he was in trouble. And then, of course, Muhammad Ali upset the world like Foreman did himself when he beat Moore many years later by knocking out George Foreman in the 8th round. Okay, now that's the first George Foreman people think of when they hear that name. And the people that knew him personally or would have known anything about him personally in the 60s and the 70s wouldn't think world's greatest grandfather, world's most huggable, lovable grandfather. They would think of, especially going back just before he started boxing, when he was a teenager, they would have thought criminal, bad apple, troublemaker, because that's kind of what he was. Listen, and I'm using George's words himself here. I recently read I finished this a couple weeks ago, even though it's taken me now to get around to it, by George Foreman. It's not a biography. George grew up in what's called the 5th Ward there in Houston. It's a very poor area, very rough area. And George was one of, I think, 7 kids. He was a big kid. His brothers and sisters always called him Mohead, and at least that's what he thought they were saying, and they thought they were picking on him, and they'd make fun of him and tell him his head was so big, and he didn't look like the rest of them. Something had to be wrong with him, and he was so hungry he could never be full, and his mother worked sometimes 2 jobs to try to feed these 7 kids because his dad was a heavy drinker and would often leave and stay gone for days or weeks before coming back to the family, and most of the money that he earned went to drinking and partying, leaving George's mom to feed these 7 kids, especially that big kid named George that the other 6 called Mohead. Well, George wouldn't find out until after he was already the heavyweight champion of the world the first time that what they were calling him was Moorhead, because his biological father was a man whose last name was Moorhead, and George didn't know that. He thought that, daddy was his daddy. It turns out that caused one of the conflicts. When his mother and father were always breaking up and getting back together, his mom went out and got pregnant by this other man, and his dad, that he thought was his dad, that he said, even till this day, that was his dad, the man that raised him, even though he would go on to meet his biological father and actually form a really good friendship with him. But dad was dad. He's the man that raised him. That caused a lot of conflict for the parents, and the other siblings knew, but George didn't. That's a really, really odd story there. But he had this internal anger, this internal rage, and he didn't use it so well. Him and his friends, if you could call them that, which at any minute he might be in a fist fight with any of them over anything, maybe just because they looked at him the wrong way, but they would go out at night and they would actually attack people. Now, George, he was big, he was strong. At 15 years old, he was already over 6 feet tall, 200 pounds. He would just hold people while his friends stole the money out of their wallets, out of their pockets, out of their wallets, and then they'd go out and they'd buy alcohol, they'd get whatever they wanted, food. George used to drink a lot in his youth. George quit school in junior high. George came from an area, and I like this. I shared this when I shared a little bit about this book a couple weeks ago. In his book, in the foreword of his book, he points out that he doesn't use foul language, and he doesn't identify people based upon skin color. So throughout the book, as he's telling his story, he doesn't say this person is black, this person is white, because George believes that there's only 2 types of people in the world. Like Viktor Frankl, survivor of the Holocaust, there's good people and there's bad people. That's it. They come in all colors, all ethnicities, all religions, all shapes and sizes. But people are either good or either bad. And he's taught himself from a young age not to discriminate based upon skin color. And a big part of that is because he was discriminated against based upon socioeconomic status. He grew up poor in the 5th Ward, but he went to school with, the overwhelming majority of the other kids were black. His teachers were black. But he was still mistreated because he was poor. George saw early in life where the kids who maybe had both parents who worked, they could afford nicer clothes. The teachers would favor them more so than they would the kids like him who wore the same pair of pants to school every day because he was so poor and he was so big he only had one pair that fit. They kind of wrote him off early as if he was going to amount to nothing, and he believed that, and he quit school in junior high. Still lived at home with mom and his siblings. They called him Mohead, but he was getting in a lot of trouble out there on the streets. Well, LBJ, I'm taking a lot of you back in time. I know a lot of you are my age or older, considerably older. A lot of baby boomers watch this channel. You'll remember when LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, started the Job Corps in the 60s to give young people who maybe needed a second chance. Well, that was George Foreman's second chance. And he left Texas and went off to Oregon to work for the Job Corps. Hated to go. His mom cried. He cried. But he went and he worked there for a couple of years, sent money home to mom. They gave him enough to live on. So he got off the streets. He wasn't going around beating people up in Houston anymore. But what he was doing is he was going around in the Job Corps beating people up in Oregon. George was still very angry. He had this inner rage. I would go out there on a limb. He never used the words in his book, but I would say he was very insecure based upon his socioeconomic upbringing. He was brought up poor, and he just felt really bad about that. And if somebody looked at him the wrong way, or if he just wanted to punch somebody, he'd go up and accuse somebody of looking at him the wrong way, and they'd start to deny it, but then he'd knock them out. It was during his time in the Job Corps that he discovered boxing. Somebody told him and said, George, you love to fight so much, you should take up boxing. And by this time, he had gone from Oregon to California to work for the Job Corps in California. Somebody directed him to the gym. He ended up going to the gym. By the time he tried this boxing thing, he got in the ring with a guy about half his size, and he said, well, gosh, this is going to be nothing. I've knocked out everybody, back in Houston in the 5th Ward. I've been knocking suckers out in Oregon. I'm going to crush this guy. Well, the guy humiliated him and embarrassed him, and that's when George learned there's a difference between street fighting and boxing. So George gets into boxing. Now, is this what changed him? Is this when he had his come to Jesus moment that turned him into a nice guy? Nope, not at all. George, if you'll remember when he was boxing through his first boxing career, the time he fought Ali in the Rumble in the Jungle, he was kind of known as like a heel, is the term they'd use in boxing, the bad guy, because George was all about offense. He hated to box. He was offense. I'm going to knock you out. Whoever gets in front of me, I'm going to knock you out. And now, mind you, his sparring partner for years was a guy named Sonny Liston, who pretty much fought the same way. Sonny Liston was the guy that Muhammad Ali beat the first time to become the champion. Sonny Liston was a bone breaker for the mob. They found him in prison. Sonny Liston, as George Foreman's sparring partner, was the only person George Foreman ever boxed up or backed up from when he was fighting. He said other than when he sparred with Sonny Liston, he was going straight at him, and he did that. But what it did is it redirected his inner anger and his turmoil, and he was able to focus and channel that into boxing. He quit drinking because one of his first trainers told him about how, here, you think about guys who were maybe Olympic gold medalists in boxing, Golden Glove winners, state champions, AAU champions. Where do they all go? You'll see them. You'll watch, like we just had an Olympic year this past summer, and you see this guy wins gold medal. I think the Olympic boxer this year won the silver. But you say, whatever happens to these guys? George learned early that 90% of them are alcoholics. Hey, they might train all day and work out all day, and they might be able to get away with it because they've got some sort of natural gift that puts them up here compared to mere mortals who are down here. But at the end of the day, if they're, drinking a case of beer every day, despite doing their training, despite working out, when they step into the ring with somebody that's of equal caliber with them as far as their craft goes, who doesn't drink 20 beers a day, they're done. I mean, they're just done. So George decided early in life he needed to get that part of his life out of his life. And there was a particular event that helped bring that about. Is one night he was out drinking with his best friend. The next day, woke up with a terrible hangover and saw that his best friend's face was all swollen and puffy and black and blue. And he asked, God, what happened to you? He said, you did, George. You got blackout drunk again last night and beat the crap out of me. And he just didn't want to do that anymore, so he stopped, channeled his focus into boxing. But he was still wayward in so many areas of his life, so many ways, particularly in regard to women. I remember when George Foreman fought for the title the second time when he won it against Michael Moore, he had 10 kids. Well, he's since had more. He's got 12. Had 12 at one point. Unfortunately, one of his daughters passed here a few years ago. She was in her 40s. She's just, I think, a year or two younger than me. But anyway, George Foreman, of course, won the heavyweight championship of the world, kept it for a while, but then, of course, he lost it to Ali. Well, but he still was... It's crazy. I was reading this book, thinking, geez, George. One of his trainers once told him, because he was on like child number 4, and by that time they all had different mothers. And one of his trainers said, George, you need to hire a lady to work for you like a maid who has a boyfriend. Because a lot of times, George, he's focusing on training. He's focused on fighting. He doesn't have time for chores, cooking and cleaning and all these things. He would hire women to come in and do this stuff for him. Then he ended up having babies with them. Well, his genius trainer said, you know what, George, get a woman who has a boyfriend That way she won't be throwing herself at you, wanting to be with the heavyweight champion of the world. And you won't be as tempted to, go after her because, every guy knows, hey, you don't touch another guy's girl, right? So he takes this advice. He hires this pretty young thing that's got a boyfriend. And a few months go by and she comes to him and she says, George, I got to talk to you about something. He's like, what? And he goes, I'm pregnant. And he thinks, oh my gosh, what's your boyfriend say about this? And she says, what's the matter what my boyfriend says about this? It ain't his baby. And he's like, well, who is it? And she says, it's yours, George. Baby number 5. So whatever. He was still just he was out there. So he lost the title to Ali, tried relentlessly to become worthy of a rematch with Ali to get it back. Never happened. He had his last fight as far as George Foreman 1 goes. This is where this strange, crazy thing happens that I almost didn't talk to you about for 2 weeks. You're going to have to hear me out on this because I think it's true. I honestly, by George, I think it's honest. I think it's real. So he fights a guy named Jimmy Young. This is 1977. Now, by this time, Don King, I know, said famous last words. I have opinions of that man that won't be spoken of right here, but Don King is helping promote George Foreman by this time. Well, he comes to George before the fight and he says, look, George, we need to string this fight out. We need to make it last longer because you're costing us money. He's like, you're knocking everybody out in 2 or 3 rounds. You need to let this one last because the longer it goes, the longer it'll air on the television channels, the more commercials they can get, the more advertising dollars they can make. The next time we fight on TV, they're going to offer us even more money because, you didn't just knock the guy out. I grew up during the Mike Tyson era, and that was always one of the big frustrations when you're a middle school, high school kid getting ready to watch that Tyson fight. The thing lasted 28 seconds and it was over. George Foreman was basically the Mike Tyson of his time. So George Foreman, he fights this guy, and Jimmy Young, and the whole time he felt that he could have ended the fight at any time, and a couple of times he almost did. When he'd almost knocked the guy out, he'd said, no, Don King told me I got to let this fight last so we can make more money. Well, as it turns out, it went the whole distance. It went 12 rounds, and Jimmy Young, who actually knocked George Foreman down, almost knocked him out in the 8th round, almost just like Ali in the Rumble in Jungle, was able to come back. He was able to outlast George. He was able to score points on him the whole second half of the fight, and Jimmy Young won by unanimous decision. Now, this fight took place in Puerto Rico. It was extremely hot. After the fight, George Foreman goes back to the dressing room area, and they were using tents. And he was dehydrated. He'd had the crap beaten out of him. He'd beaten the crap out of another guy. He's pacing back and forth. He's kind of delirious, and the media is just asking him questions, and they're trying to get an interview. George kind of goes like almost unconscious. And then here is where I'm going to read to you what George says from his book, because I don't want to change his words any. I want to tell you about the come to Jesus moment George Foreman had that I thought was not true, farthest from the truth, that now, several weeks later, I do believe is true, and I'm going to tell you why I believe it's true. But George is fighting about he's talking about how he actually thought he was going to die after this fight. He felt his life force fleeing his body, okay? But then a voice came to him that said, if you believe in God, why are you afraid to die? And now, mind you, up until this point, George Foreman had no relationship with God, with Jesus. He had nothing to do with religion. He said throughout his book even, and he said in interviews since, he thought that religion was for poor people. And I've heard that. It's for poor people who don't have anything but faith. You don't got no money in the bank. You don't have any nice cars in the driveway. Well, all you got's faith and hope. So why not just sit around and pray to God, pray to Jesus, pray you'll have the things you need, pray you'll have the things you want. That's who religion was for in George Foreman's mind. He had everything. He had wealth. He had fame. He had women, obviously. Lots of babies' mamas, and then lots of women on the side, aside from the babies' mamas. Had it all. Millions. So still, and I'm going back to George here, still the voice insisted as he felt that he was going to die, if you believe in God, then why are you afraid to die? George's words, I blotted out the words with another recitation of what I had to live for. I'm still George Foreman. I can still box. I can still give money to charity and for cancer. The doctor that delivered him had come down with cancer, and George donated $10,000 to cancer at the time for cancer research. As if offended, the voice grew urgent. I don't want your money. I want you. Now, if you haven't figured this out yet, this is the voice of Jesus Christ speaking to George Foreman. And it wasn't saying, I want your money, I want you. This wasn't George Foreman making a decision to turn his life over to Christ and serve Christ through all his earthly deeds and duties. This was Jesus Christ telling George Foreman he wanted him. Okay? Now, George again, I believed I was really dying. The invincibility I'd always felt had been an illusion. Life can end as quickly as a smile. From somewhere came my own voice. God, I believe in you, but not enough to die. To this day, I don't know whether I said the words aloud or just heard them in my head. As I fell to the floor of my dressing room, my leg crumbling beneath me, my nostrils filled with the stink of infection, I recognized it instantly as the smell of absolute despair and hopelessness. Then I felt myself transported to a far-off place. And he talks about how he went into this realm that he just called nothingness. There was nothing there, and beyond the nothing, there was just more nothing. And he felt suspended in this place. And a sledgehammer of crashing sadness came down upon him because it occurred to him that even though he had all the cars, the houses, and the money that he'd worked for, it counted for nothing in this nowhere place. He was somewhere where none of this mattered. They were like ashes, he said, that crumbled from burned paper when you touched it. When I looked back, I saw it all crumbling behind me. What counted was that I was going to die, and I hadn't told the people I loved how much they'd meant to me. Did I even know? I'd taken them for granted. Mom, my children. I'd not said goodbye. I'd not held them. I'd exchanged harsh words. I'd ignored them. I'd expressed my love mostly through gifts. So at this point, up until this point in his life, George Foreman thought, well, yeah, I love that person. We'll just give him a gift. Give him something that costs a lot of money, and that way they'll know I love them. One after another, at life speed, my regrets whizzed past. As they did, the sadness continued to squeeze the life from me. I'm dead. This is death. This is what it's like to die. I said, I don't care if this is death. I still believe there's a God. I had nothing else to lose. This was my last punch. It was as if I'd already died and I didn't care anymore. At that, a giant hand lifted and carried me out of the nothingness. This is the hand of Christ he's talking about. Suddenly, feeling blood flowing through my veins again, I was back in the dressing room, lying on the training table. They must have carried me over after my leg crumbled. I looked up at the circle of faces, all these people were around him, and he says, hey, I'm dying. And he said it cheerfully. But tell everybody I'm dying for God. That great hand had rescued me from a horrible place. I was going to trust it now. I wasn't scared, George says. They all humored me, he says. That's all right, George. You're going to be fine, George. Don't worry, George, all of them. You're a man, champ. You can get another fight. But he wasn't talking about fighting, boxing. This was the furthest from his mind. For some reason, this is George again, I yelled, I don't care where you take me. I'm George Foreman. Because this is crazy. At this time, he said he felt as if he was being taken to different places around the world. He was put inside the bodies of different people, worshiping God in different ways in different places. He says, I don't care where you take me. I'm George Foreman. I just lost a boxing match. I'm in this dressing room. I don't want to be anybody else. I'm who I want to be. I'm George Foreman. I lost the fight. I don't care where you take me. That's all I'm ever going to be, and I'm never going to forget that. That's when he says, that's when I stopped moving here and there. Keith West, the doctor who traveled with him, grabbed his head. And George said, hey, Dr. West, move your hands because the thorns on his head are making him bleed. What George saw was blood pouring out of his own forehead, but it wasn't from the boxing match. The doctor didn't say a word. He just smiled. Hey, Mr. Fuller, I said, this is George Foreman again. Move your hands. He's bleeding where they crucified him. I saw blood on my hands. This is like stigmata. George Foreman was having a stigmatic type moment. And I was reading this. I was like, all right, Big George, I'm a fan. I've been a fan for years. I'm glad I finally got around to reading your autobiography, but I'm not so sure I'm following you here with this stigmata. Okay? And then he yells, hey, Jesus is coming alive inside me. George Foreman is yelling this. They humored him some more. It's okay, George. You'll win another fight. Don't worry. George says, I'm not talking about boxing. Jesus Christ is coming alive inside me. And then his brother Roy comes over and he's laughing at him. He says, yeah, that's not going to happen, George. You're not clean enough. Well, George Foreman, feeling as if he needed to be purified and clean for Jesus, got up. This man's laying there literally dying. Gets up and goes into the showers and is bathing, getting clean in the shower, continually to scream, I feel Jesus coming alive inside me. He comes out of the shower. He goes around. He's kissing everybody. And people are running from him. They're like, get away from me, George. He's chasing him down in the locker room. And his trainer's saying, you may as well just let him do it because he's not going to stop till he does it. So everybody lets him kiss him. He's saying, I love you to all of his friends and his family's there. I love you. Jesus Christ is alive inside me. Well, then they realize he's getting ready to go outside the tent and kiss the thousands and thousands of people outside who'd been in attendance for the fight. And they're like, we can't let him do that. He was still naked and wet from the shower. So they grabbed him and didn't let him go. They eventually got him to the hospital there in Puerto Rico, and he spent 2 days in the hospital. 2 days in the hospital. And when they finally let the reporters in, they told him to tell the reporters he was suffering from heat prostration. George said he'd never heard the term before in his life. He had to say it 5 or 6 times, heat prostration, heat prostration. And then as soon as the reporters came in, he just yelled, heat prostration. And the reporter's like, what's that? Well, one of his trainers had stayed in the room to explain it to the reporters so he'd get it out. They didn't want the world to hear this story that was very, again, like I said, very stigmatic of Jesus Christ coming alive inside of George Foreman. But you know what? It happened. George Foreman's life then took a major change. He then recently, or shortly after that, would marry a woman to whom he stayed faithful and is still married all these years later. It's coming on 50 years. It's more than 40 years. He stopped boxing. He didn't ball a fist for the next 10 years. He would in time turn his life over to God, and this is how that happened. Well, actually, God took his life away from him and did his work through George. I'm convinced of that. But George Foreman, shortly after this, he was in a gym and he saw a mother in there with her teenage son, and she was begging one of the trainers to take her son under his wing and turn him into a boxer. Said he was mean, he was heading nowhere good, and he was heading there fast. And George Foreman was seeing this. He felt like he should do something, but he thought, no, that's not my problem. That's that kid's problem. That's that kid's mom's problem. He didn't supersede, intervene. He didn't step in the middle and say, hey, I'm sorry, it's 18 degrees out here. It's 18 degrees. I'm a little bit chilly. I'm freezing, but I wanted to tell you this story. So that's why my words, got a few of my words mixed up there. Well, shortly after that young man shot another person and killed them and went to prison for life. And George felt regret about that like he'd never felt before. That's when he started working with youth. He started his youth center there in Houston, and he got the kids in playing basketball, baseball, boxing, lifting weights, gave them somewhere to go to keep them out of trouble. And he was self-funding this until he ran out of money. And, of course, that's when he got back into boxing. And that's when he made his comeback, and that would, of course, lead to him beating 26-year-old Michael Moore. Now, I didn't think he's a pastor. The North Houston Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I don't know if he's still active with his preaching there, but gave away more money than he probably ever earned, even though his net worth is still $300 million, according to. I was just trying to get the facts straight. It's not that I admire the man for his money. That has nothing to do with it. But it shows how by doing God's work and giving away everything he could to help people in need, he still has more than he'll ever be able to spend. Around the time I finished this book, I was watching a movie. One of my favorite actors is Morgan Freeman, and he was in a movie with another one of my favorite, I think is a great actor, Gene Hackman. It's an old movie. It's called Under Suspicion. There's a scene in that movie where, Gene Hackman's character is suspected of a murder that he may or may not have committed, two of them actually, and Morgan Freeman is the investigating officer. And Hackman's character changes his story again, and Morgan Freeman's character says, you gotta understand, my ears are pricking up every time you're changing your story. That gave me an aha, because my ears pricked up when I read George Foreman's story. Actually seeing blood coming off his forehead and in his hands from where Christ was crucified, Jesus coming alive in him, I said, okay, that happened in 1977. He's had 60 years. 77, 87, 97, 07, 17. Well, he's had 45 years. Hey, it's cold. My math sucks when I get cold. He's had 45 years to change his story. So why is it taking me 2 weeks to get around to telling you this story? Because for the last 2 weeks, I started watching and reading everything I could find about George Foreman and his come to Jesus moment, as it were, that we'll call it. And in 45 years, he's never changed a word of his story. I watched interviews with him, talking to Larry King about it, other places where he's got his own. I'm going to put his channel on the end of this. This saddens me. I woke up this morning and found out that Meatloaf died. The great singer, 2 Out of 3 Ain't Bad, Paradise by the Dashboard Lights. He made a comeback when I was in college around the same time George Foreman was making his comeback with I Would Do Anything for Love, Bat Out of Hell 2. 74, Meatloaf, same age as George Foreman. Listen, no one lives forever. Let the greats, the people that mean something to you, know that they mean something to you while they're alive. I'm going to put George Foreman's YouTube channel on the end of this video, the very end. He's only got 39,000 subscribers. It's a sad world when some guy like me has 274,000 subscribers on YouTube, and a great like George Foreman, great boxer, great man, one of the greatest human beings to ever live on earth, only has 39,000 followers, subscribers. Go like his channel. You'll see his channel at the end of mine. But I walk away from George's story with this. Having a good hobby, something to do, something to keep you active, that might keep your idle hands from doing so much of the devil's work as boxing did with George. But George truly he was one of the greatest boxers ever. A couple different times in history, he was the greatest ever. But when God entered his life in such an amazing way, like I've never heard told of before, George Foreman became one of the greatest human beings to ever walk the face of the earth. He's done so much good. He changed his ways. He's a wonderful person. I just hope everybody will go over to his channel now. Just subscribe, like it, give him some love. But for 45 years, he has told the same story, and my ears never perked up one time while reading or watching interviews of his come to Jesus moment, because he never changed his story. And as odd and as fantastic as his story sounds, I'm convinced it's true. I'm convinced Jesus Christ came alive in George Foreman. There you have it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you've ever had any sort of come to Jesus moments like that, any sort of experiences, please feel free to share them in the comments below. And we'll see you for more next time.